At the end of the day, regardless of what gamers think about NFTs or blockchain or tokens, they're going to play what their friends play, right? And if the players are voting and saying, hey, I want to own my items, I want yield on this, I want to be able to do certain things in the game, it may not make the most sense financially to provide these things, but you need to capture and keep your clientele and market share. So
this week's podcast is brought to you by App Growth Summit. Join Upptic and hundreds of app growth experts from major brands, apps, and games in San Francisco on September 14th. Enjoy a full day of networking and 14 strategy sessions with leaders from across the industry. To request an invite, go to appgrowthsummit.com. Welcome to Games Growth with Upptic, a podcast about the discipline of scaling digital games. We speak with industry experts and investigate trends to highlight the strategies, technology, and tactical methodologies to profitably grow your game to massive global audiences. My name is Xander Agosta, Director of Marketing here at Upptic.
And I'm Warren Woodward, co-founder of Upptic. Yeah, so we had a really interesting episode today. We had our friend Atif Khan, who's his third time on. He is currently VP of BizDev at thirdweb. And then we had Ed Chang, who is the head of gaming at Ava Labs, who are the creators of Avalanche Network. So we dove a fair amount into the kind of the state of Web3 gaming at large, which is a topic that we talk about a lot at this podcast. But we also dug a bit into Appchains, which is something that Ava Labs is focused on quite a bit right now. And also thirdweb has been championing from their end as well. Xander, what did you learn about Appchains today?
Well, basically everything. I remember getting scolded at GDC by some Web3 folks for not knowing what Appchains were, and I've now feel very comfortable and confident that I know exactly what they are. I don't give you a spoiler. That's why you have to listen to the rest of the episode. I mean, I really definitely recommend sticking around with these guys. Ed and Atif are both incredibly eloquent speakers, very, very passionate about the Web3 space, so they do come from that perspective. But I think they both have very compelling arguments for what the vision of gaming looks like, how Web3 fits into the vision of gaming overall, and why their companies are well positioned for this. So if you're at all interested in the Web3 gaming space, I think it really makes sense to listen to this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I also felt a little naive. I knew vaguely what Appchains were, but I didn't really understand why a typical game developer who's maybe thinking about dabbling in Web3 to improve their game design, like why that matters to them. We have a big problem in Web3 with using this internal jargon that is alienating people outside of the space. And so it was good to kind of demystify and just like talk about some very practical use cases of Appchains and why they might be a good entry point actually for the first thing you build with Web3 tech rather than something that's like a more advanced thing. And as you said, like, yeah, Atif and Ed are both great. A thing that stands out to me at like this time in the market is like, these are experienced dudes. So,
yeah.
You know, Atif, formerly longtime executive at Facebook, has been through a number of other large ad tech and tech companies, a lot related to growth and user acquisition. And then Ed, on the other side, a very experienced background from electronic arts. So these are not like your typical crypto degens. These are very seasoned executives that have the pedigree from the traditional world of tech, but are still passionate and head down in the space for what Web3 can do for gaming. And I think it's refreshing to see, I guess, validating in some ways that there's people that have the kind of pedigrees of them that are still care about the space. Sometimes I even have those moments of self-doubt of like, is this stuff really worth pursuing? Am I crazy for thinking that there's something here? So it was cool to hear their perspective. Of course, we always like opinions that validate our own, right?
Yeah. We'll get plenty of those.
Yeah, so we hope you guys enjoy the episode today. We think it's a good one. As always, the episode was brought to you by a team here at Upptic. So here at Upptic, we do all things to help games grow. What does that mean? It means we do user acquisition, creative development, data analysis, and we bring a really cool in-house tool set built by our engineering and product team of tools that no one gets to use except us. So we've built some really cool proprietary tech around predictive media buying, around working with iOS scan privacy policies, around measuring Discord and community growth. And it's all stuff that lets us get better outcomes for the games that we work on, as well as the teams that just license our tech to empower their own games growth. So if any of that sounds interesting, if you would like to bring more players into your games, which a lot of teams do, reach out to us. We're always happy to talk. You can reach us at upptic.com. That's upptic.com.
Awesome. Enjoy the episode. Atif, Ed, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Atif, I don't know if you know this, but we recorded with Andrew Green last week. So unfortunately, you aren't the first person to be on the podcast 3 times, but you are in a very, very small circle of folks who have a hat trick on the Upptic podcast. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. That's always a pleasure.
So we're just going to jump right into it. We'll start with some backgrounds. Atif, if you want to go ahead first, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing at your new company.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me, guys. My name is Atif, VP of Business at thirdweb. Prior to this was at another Web3 infrastructure company. And then prior to that was at Facebook, where I got to know Warren for many years. Been in games for 10 years, been in startups for a little bit longer. Don't want to say how long, otherwise I'll age myself. But really, really excited to talk a little bit more about games, Web3, and Appchains.
Awesome. And Ed, welcome. First time. We don't hold that against you. Please tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing at Ava Labs.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Ed Chang. I lead our gaming biz dev here at Ava Labs. So we are one of the custodians of the Avalanche protocol. We are a layer 1 protocol. And yeah, I lead our gaming. So I spent most of my career in the gaming industry, was at EA for about 5 years before this, and joined because I saw the opportunity in Web3 gaming. And it's been a really fun ride. It's been almost 2 years, and I've known Atif for probably most of my time here full-time in Web3.
Awesome. Super excited to have you guys both on today as kind of veterans of gaming and in the nascent Web3 gaming space. I think fair to say veterans of that angle as well too. All of our teams kind of coming at this from different sides. So I think this can be a really good discussion today, kind of looking at different aspects of the space, the role of Appchains in the ecosystem, and kind of where we think things are going. Maybe up top, it'd be good to get just a few definitions for some of our traditional gaming audience. Actually, either of you guys can start off here, but maybe just a little definitions of layer 1 versus layer 2 protocols for the layperson.
Yeah, I can give kind of a layman's stab here. For me, like working full-time in Web3 hasn't been that long as well, so totally get it. I think generally a layer 1 protocol is a network that depends on its own validator set for security, right? For validating the network and transactions. And layer 2s, as you see them, generally depend on the security of the underlying layer 1 network. So most of the layer 2s that you see are layer 2s of Ethereum, and they find some way to effectively post transactions back to Ethereum in different manners.
Awesome. That was a good, concise description. Atif, you for this one. So expanding on that, what are dapps? What are appchains? What are sidechains? And how are they related to each other? This will be some good table setting for the audience.
Yeah, and we swear we're going to tie this all back to games. But first, let's get these definitions out of the way.
Yeah. I feel like I'm getting a multiple choice test right now and seeing how I'm graded. So on the dApp side, dApps is just another way in the Web2 term to describe apps or applications or content within those chains. App chains themselves are a concept that Ava Labs has been really pushing with subnets and is kind of the leader in the space on that side. But it's essentially your own chain out of a box. So a chain that rolls into a layer 1 or a layer 2. And then side chains is, just another chain off of a layer 1. So examples of that are Polygon's POS chain, for example, versus their layer 2 is more of like the Polygon ZK EVM.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the definitions up top, guys. So maybe to start out, let's just kind of dig a little bit into current state of gaming. So it hasn't been the brightest 12 months for Web3 gaming. That being said, all three of our teams here on this call are still very focused on the space. What has you guys passionate and excited, and what's kind of your whole thesis on why the gaming industry at large should still be caring about Web3 technology and what it can mean for gaming in 2023?
I could start from the protocol perspective, but I will say that, we are in this sideways or bear market, whatever you want to call it. But I think I could safely say that over the last 2 years that I've been seriously looking at this space, kind of the quality of game devs has just drawn up and to the right? So the teams that we're talking to now, they have really rich experience in what traditional gaming, large publishers, indie publishers, they know their stuff. And I think every time things happen, whether positive or negative or neutral, you learn, right? And so we started with this 2-token system that actually kind of pioneered, and everyone was copying that and realized why that wasn't great. And then we moved to 1 token, and now it's like, do you need a token, right? And I think even the order of operations and how teams are thinking about user acquisition, or when they're dropping their NFTs or things like that, they're thinking about it from a much more Web2 lens. And I think a lot of the infra stuff that companies like thirdweb are pioneering to make that UI UX so much better compared to Web3, how it's traditionally done, I think that makes me really bullish about the space, as well as, there are just some really strong teams that are always building out there, and the tech is improving.
Yeah, I can definitely confirm that. There's the percentage of teams I talk to that actually have a game versus an idea for a game and just some low quality NFT they're trying to bring to market. It definitely a lot of maturation we've seen. How about you, Atif? What's keeping you excited and passionate about the space in 2023?
I think the bear for Web3 gaming is kind of an incorrect label, right? If you take a step back and look at games typically take 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years to make. And we're kind of just starting to get to that 2.5 year stage of when a lot of these big games raised money. And I think a lot of people that don't have that games experience that are in crypto were like, okay, they raised money, they'll be out in the game in 6 months, and then we'll take off, right? And I think the big thing that we're seeing is the people that have been in the games industry know that it takes time, right, to actually build that game. And so now we're starting to see real alphas and betas and, like you said, games that are focused on user acquisition and actually driving content, like really great content. And so for me, like, we're starting to see the first part of that 2 to 3 year cycle where games are coming out. And so that's why I'm really excited. And then to Ed's point, we're actually seeing people with games experience that are trying to take the medium to the next level. And then the last thing is, like, Google now has a policy where NFTs are okay on the App Store. And I'm sure Apple will be a fast follow. And so there's a lot of positive signs if you take a step back and look at it from actually understanding like game development cycles.
Yeah, those are all great points, Atif. And I think a narrative that I've seen is that era of GameFi is done. That was like a really minimum viable product of what Web3 gaming could be, and very focused on the speculator side. Honestly, for our business, we're in the business of launching and scaling games profitably for developers. Like this third quarter in 2023, we are launching more Web3 games to mainstream platforms than we ever have. Anytime in the bull market, I think we have like 8 launches, and they're all on mainstream platforms. It's all on App Store, Play Store, Epic Store. And there's no longer this like, hey, it's a Web2 game or a Web3 game. It's just shipping games. And some of those games of more forward-thinking developers we're seeing use Web3 technology just to ship better or more interesting games, or games with more robust economies. And it's been a real shift in just the philosophy of what it means to be a quote-unquote Web3 game that we've been seeing from our side, and a lot of maturation.
So tying back to the topic at hand, which is Appchains in the context of gaming, let's talk a little bit about that. Understanding that we're in a place, a couple years after we've gone on our big bull run, people are a little more cautious, people are a little more reticent to implement new technologies. What is the practical application today for Appchain technology in gaming? Let's just start right there.
Yeah, I think as Atif called out earlier, at Avalanche, our killer feature, if you will, is what we call subnets, right? It's probably one of the early app chains out there that we've seen like a lot of fast following. And I think it's great that other chains are also coming to that conclusion that that's the best way to scale, right? And so what a subnet is basically allows you to deploy your own private block space on top of our main chain. So you don't have to go do what Ronin did and made their own whole chain. There's a lot of headaches and technical infrastructure and lift behind that. And you get to leverage the security of the network. So we've got over 1,300 validators, for example, in our ecosystem. It's very decentralized. And you can do really cool things like custom gas tokens, right? So we talk about the economics of games. Like, well, sometimes when you have a surplus of tokens, well, instead of using AVAX, for example, as your gas token, you can use your Upptic token, for example, for a game, right? And then there's a lot of really cool things you can do to reward validators and that kind of stuff. But I think the first and foremost thing is the scale and transaction fees. So I think one mistake that we see a lot of game developers make when they come into the space is they know gaming really well, right? And in gaming, for the most part, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, it's going to give you the same product. It's like 99.9999% uptime. It's the same service. It's kind of cheap. Or you use something like Stripe or Venmo or something like that. It's all pretty much the same thing out of the box. And they tend to assume that your blockchain is the same. And I think in this stage, where we're still in very early stages of crypto and not all chains are created equal, that is one mistake that we do see developers make a lot. Sometimes they make it all smart and then they'll come back, or we'll have those conversations, right? And so I think that the key thing here is applications that need to scale to a lot of on-chain transactions probably need an app chain environment like a subnet. Otherwise, it's going to be very painful when your transaction gets reverted, right? Or it takes forever to process, or it's lagging, or you're paying a ton in gas fees. So, DeFi Kingdom is one of the earlier crypto games. They're still doing really, really well. They're doing over 1 million transactions a day on their subnet and humming along fine, right? So there are games, for example, that may have a lot of MAUs, but very few on-chain transactions. It may not matter as much where they put the game, given that there's going to be fewer on-chain transactions. So There's kind of that delineation as well. The last thing I would say is one narrative and use case that we're seeing a lot right now is kind of this platform narrative on subnet, right? Because you could publish a bunch of different games, have shared economics across them, drive value to that underlying token or the business. So an example of that is the team at Merit Circle. They're one of the kind of the largest gaming DAOs out there. They're building a subnet called Beam, publishing a bunch of their games. We've been working with them and pretty excited about like this steam of Web3 cliche that actually comes, to fruition with the right team.
Awesome. What about you, Atif? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I was actually going to dive into kind of the last point that Ed made, which I think is really, really important, right? If you're publishing either as a single studio or similar to Merit Circle, the Appchain thesis is very powerful, right? In my opinion, because when you look at kind of the landscape of games today, it's really hard to acquire users at scale at the right cost that backs out to the right LTV. And if you use Appchains the right way, if you're effective with it, you can essentially use it as a tool that drives user acquisition through, let's say, NFTs or tokens, whichever you prefer, that essentially you can cross promote. Like we're going back to the 2012 mobile ad days of Tapjoy, right? Cross promotion, which decrease your cost of acquisition, increase your LTV, and potentially increase your retention from game to game. And so think of it from a publisher's perspective, you can now actually drive utility with a token throughout your ecosystem the way that Ed described. And so for me, that's really the big, like, hey, this is a huge opportunity from a publishing standpoint. And if you look at like the history of Web2 publishing, specifically with mobile, there hasn't been a lot of really great publishing businesses. And Web3 might actually enable that in a way that, well, not only actually, instead of having a lot of shit coins, as we call them, right, or meme coins, you actually have coins or tokens that drive utility and then actually keep players within an ecosystem. It's almost like a closed ecosystem within an open ecosystem that allows for all of that digital ownership, transfer of value, all of the things that everybody that's excited about Web3 wants, but then breaks it down into more specifically what the value is for a publisher or a studio.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there specific examples? So I'm really, really curious about the game design component of why you're doing stuff on Web3 versus in traditional closed servers. What are some of the key unlocks that you see from a game design perspective that are really fun and interesting that come from using Appchains as opposed to using the traditional game infrastructure?
I think there's a couple. The first is this concept of truly owning your items. Look, the best in class example today is frankly probably Web2 products, right? Think about CSGO, right? 6 figures for a knife or certain skins. Roblox is a great example of this playground where it's this arcade that you can, sell items. And so they're kind of closed chains, right? Roblox really is. But I think that idea where the main top AAA games today they are closed ecosystems. You buy directly from the publisher. You don't really have liquidity on them. You can buy more. That's all you can do, right? So what will motivate a large publisher to move in that direction? Well, probably when the players demand it and start voting with their wallets, and hopefully as these top Web3 games come out. That's one. I think number 2 is kind of the payments rails, right? So there are a lot of things that happen in traditional gaming outside of the game itself, right? I was looking at an EVE Online job board yesterday on Reddit, for example, right? Sorry, there's landscaping going on site. But just being able to pay creators directly or have those mechanisms to do so, right? There's a AAA extraction shooter in our ecosystem called Shrapnel, right? And it's a really exciting game. And what's pretty cool is they have ways for you to do in-game wagering or the custom maps that creators make that are played the most, you get rewarded, right? I think about my old CS days where I was playing AIM map and OP map, and it was just I don't really know who made it. There's no way of kind of rewarding those creators. And then just the payments rails themselves. When you introduce things like stablecoin and whatnot, transaction fees, the ability to be how seamless that is, unlocks a lot of really cool things you can do with micropayments, microtransactions, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy that the guy who invented Dota got paid 0 for it. It sounds like in the Web3 universe, have potential for that not to necessarily be the case. What about you, Atif? Have you seen any really cool use cases so far that justify people really going through the innovation tax of implementing Web3 in their games?
For me, the way to think about Web3, what it enables is really an equal value exchange, right? If you look at the history of gaming, a player or a gamer, let's go back to the console days, right? You pay $50, you get a game, the studio gets $50 and you get a finite amount of value, which is whatever is contained within that PS4 disc or CD or PS5. Mobile gaming was interesting because you had to provide a little bit of incremental value for people to want to have IAPs or watch ads to actually get those coins or whatever points or whatever it is in the game itself. And for me, Web3 enables a true value exchange, right? Because of the digital ownership piece, because of the value that you exchange, the game developer has to consistently drop content that actually keeps the community engaged, right? Community is so important to Web3. And I think it's important to games in general, right? There's all these crazy communities in Web2 games around things like CSGO and RuneScape and many others, but there's no real value exchange there. And for me, I think the big thing is the value exchange, in my opinion, will drive innovation and lengthen the cycle of these games for many years, right? And so I think that's what's super interesting in terms of use cases is like, how do you drive equal value exchange where the community actually has input into what type of content or what game gets built over time?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Atif and Ed. And one thing that I would put extra emphasis on that I feel like is sort of the underrated and harder to quantify aspect of building with Web3 tech is to use Web to value. And like value can be defined in more traditional senses, but there's also just sort of novelty that can be built into game design once you start adding these like ownable and collectible layers. And I feel like those are things that haven't been fully explored or capitalized on yet. And even if there's not a value in the sort of traditional financial aspect, just in the value of a player getting to actually own an item in the game, interact with another player in a way that they couldn't before. And I think that's still kind of like where we're still in the very early phases of new things that Web3 can facilitate.
Okay, so I think we kind of all agree on the basic premise of why Web3 game tech is interesting and engaging. I hope this is compelling to our audience as well. I think if you listen to this podcast, you've probably heard the spiel and you're at least somewhat on board. Let's talk a little bit more about the tech and what differentiates a sidechain versus a subchain, and like practically, what does that mean? Because like there's some obvious benefits, I think, to using a subchain versus doing something like what Ronan did. Can you explain to the layperson what those advantages are?
Yeah, I think going back to my earlier example, right, of like if you think about a Web 2 analogous one where, let's talk about payments rails maybe, right? So it's basically like saying, I don't necessarily like using Stripe because I think their API leaves a little bit to be desired. I'm going to build my own like payments infrastructure alongside my core product, right? And so in a world where teams raise a certain amount of funding and you're a startup, the less you can focus on the headache of validators, uptime. Okay, do I have the right bridges? Do I get this token listed on an exchange? How do my servers work? Do I have geographic coverage? Do I have an SDK? Do I have an API? Like all those things shouldn't be things that game developers need to worry about. I think there's a world that if the next game to 100 million on-chain users, maybe at that point, it makes sense for you to deploy your own chain. Then you can attract all these kind of, even like mid-core, like AAA games with the budgets, with the amount they raise, isn't enough and they have to raise more rounds. So right. I think that's the key aspect, which is you don't actually want to build your own chain. It makes a lot of sense for you to let somebody else worry about that, especially with chains like ours that have that dev support and that hand-holding, or even like we get closer and closer to like one-click subnet deployment. That sounds amazing to me if I were building a game as well.
Yeah. So it's like basically, unless you want to be some massive, fully vertically integrated company, which kind of goes against why you would do a Web3 product in the first place, it makes more sense just to push the leverage of building all the technical infrastructure off to someone else.
Exactly. And I think the other piece is that, especially when we look at like these large studios and publishers, for example, Zynga just announced like their first game, right? They were talking about it today. The thing is, you definitely don't want to go build all your infrastructure, your chain yourself, but there also is risk to just being on a monolithic chain, right? One where you share that block space with everybody else. And a lot of these chains, like they're great, they're beefy, they have a strong validator set, transactions are typically pretty fast and pretty cheap. But in that event where there's another game that's pushing a bunch of transactions, maybe there's a new coin that drops or like an exchange, you're basically sharing that block space, right? It's like a freeway and you just never know how congested it's going to be. Maybe you're like, hey, at midnight, there's never any traffic on the freeway, but maybe there's an accident, maybe there's construction. Like, you just don't know these things. And so it's very hard as a game developer to fully trust, I would say, being on a monolithic chain because you don't own that block space, right? And we know that Web2 gamers can be very fickle, right? Like one mix up and they're going to Reddit and downloading, or like they're on social because they're really upset at like the worst time possible, something happens. So we try to help game studios kind of hedge against that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can think of like some practical examples in like my history, Web3 gaming. Like I remember when Sunflower game, or friends of ours, like when that game first blew up on Polygon, and I was playing some other games at the time, and it was like impossible to play them. No shade to Polygon, our partner, we love them. But it's a good example of where I think what you're saying, Ed, is like a benefit of as an app chain is you're not impacted in the same way by what some other game, like if some other project is blowing up and putting like crazy throughput of transactions, you don't have that same sort of second order effect that you would if you're using an app chain. Is our understanding there correct?
Yeah, exactly. And look, we've talked to games who are built on other, like let's call them monolithic chains. And there's been examples where I was talking to a game the other day and he said, oh yeah, I was doing X number of transactions and the chain basically asked me to move a lot of these back to a database, right? Because like it was kind of clogging up the chain. So like those situations do exist. And for us, it's like, why wouldn't you put as many things on chain as you wanted to? Because that's kind of the whole point here, right?
Atif, any insight on your end?
No, I mean, just to add, like, if you take a step back and look at the journey of a Web3 developer, whether it's an app or a game, there's already so much complexity, right? You need essentially 7 or 8 different providers to just build the app. And then on top of that, now you're going to go and try to build your own app chain. That's just a lot of complexity. And I think that's where we come in. And then Ava Labs team comes in. But, you know, if you're a Web3 developer, you need RPC nodes, storage, gateways, wallets, payments, contracts, infrastructure, APIs, SDKs. And now you add that a complexity of an app chain. And I think one of the key things, and we hear a lot about it, but I think is going to continue to happen, is more of kind of what Ava Labs is trying to do with their one-click deployment. Very similarly on the software layer side, how do we have one-click deployments on our side where you can just get all of those different services? And the key, though, is interoperability, right? You don't want to be working with different providers that lock you into their service, but actually give you the customization and flexibility that you need. And I think the more that we can do from an infrastructure side, whether it's software or the blockchain, to obfuscate that, make it simpler, make it easier, I think that's where all of this needs to go. I think one of the problems that we've had with game development in Web3 is there's too many infrastructure providers. There's not enough horizontal solutions. You know, you got to go to 7 or 8 different providers. It creates obstacles, right? And when I think about like building a startup, the number one thing founders should think about is how do I decrease the amount of obstacles that I face? Because there's already so many that you will face over the course of whatever you're building, right?
Atif, you've sort of referenced this, but we haven't really gotten into this yet at all. Can you sort of give the high-level summary of what thirdweb actually is and what services you provide? Because I think it might be relevant to some of the folks listening.
Yeah, I kind of did it in my previous little spiel, but I'll give it to you again, right? So we're essentially a one-stop shop software layer that allows developers to have all of the different components that they need in one place. So RPC nodes, storage, gateway, wallets, payments, smart contracts. But the key differentiator between us and other providers is that we're interoperable. We really do believe in the Web3 thesis in that you can have the customization and flexibility you need to succeed. So if you're like, hey, I love Alchemy, I love IPFS for RPC and storage, but I want to use you thirdweb for contracts, wallets, and payments, awesome. If you want to use Magic and Coinbase for wallets and payments, but you want to use us for RPC storage and contracts, great. We essentially provide that one-stop shop, but we provide the flexibility and customization that allows us to partner with the best players in the space. So that way you're not locked into our tools. We believe that we build the best baseline product, but we know that developers want different things. And so we provide that flexibility, and everything is open source. So not only are we making developers' lives easier, we're also living the actual thesis of Web3. When you look at a lot of our competition, that's not their thesis. It's build this tool and then lock you into that product. And that's foundationally against everything that we've built.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And we definitely take a similar philosophy, focus on different part of the games ecosystem. But here at Upptic, we try to be very technology agnostic and facilitate our own tools. But we ultimately want the game developers we support to be able to use whatever tech or combination of tech they think is best for their game, and then pipe that through our platform. So I definitely appreciate that agnostic approach. I'd love to maybe move the conversation a little bit. We've talked a little bit about some of the current evolutions and solutions in Web3 tech and how the practical implications for game developers. I'd love to talk a little bit about the future. Like, what are the next big problems or opportunities that both of y'all are thinking about for just improving the user experience, both for game developers and for gamers in Web3? So what are the next big pain points that the industry should be addressing, or technologies you're excited about that may be addressing these soon?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, I think I've said this pretty consistently for 2 years, is we need games that actually people want to play that aren't, Web3 native. I think that's the first thing. And we're starting to see that, right? Like, pretty excited about what the Parallel team has put out on Base. And that seems to be getting a lot of hype on crypto Twitter. But let's see if that translates into Web2 audience. I think that's a baseline. We need to drive games that drive users that don't know they're in a Web3 game. And I think you said that earlier. We have to keep saying that. I think it's the most important thing. Is what happens on crypto Twitter and what happens in reality, I think, are two different things. So I think that's the first thing.
Oh, yeah.
I think one thing that we're really excited about is smart contract wallets and account abstraction. We really, and we have a demo app, Web3 Warriors, that we've used to highlight that technology. That we believe is going to be really, really powerful. We believe that that will allow for a really great UI UX and also allow for a seamless experience, right? If you have a paymaster that is abstracting away a lot of those gas fees, so that way it's taking care of everything on the back end, we really are excited about that. And we're going to put a lot more stuff on that, but that's kind of one.
Got it. And Atif, can you kind of talk through from a player perspective what that experience is like? Does that mean that I just start playing a game and I don't even have to know or take an active process for a wallet to be created on my behalf, so I can start having those on-chain items as part of my gameplay experience? What is the end user experience?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways that we've implemented it. You can have a traditional, Web 2 single sign-on with the same players that you would use, and then that translates into a wallet. It's abstracted away, and so that way a user has all of their different gas fees that are paid through a paymaster, and they don't even see it. There's no latency. There's no pop-up. There's no, hey, you got to sign or pay this transaction. Another way that we've done it, which is kind of set up through that Web3 Warriors demo, is a local wallet that transitions into a smart contract wallet whenever you want to take things on chain. Very similarly to this recording, right? Like you sign up for username and password, everything's stored on your local machine. And when a user decides that they want to take things on chain, it's a smart contract wallet is created on the back end, and then it has the same experience as that I just described on the Web 2 side. The same thesis there, easy onboarding through different things that people are used to, whether it's Web 2 experience or your local wallet, and everything is abstracted away. So the game just keeps playing and you essentially are just playing a game, and all the Web 3 stuff is in the back end.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be more seamless, I think, for the average Web3 gaming experience. It's still pretty brutal, but yeah, the tech is definitely starting to show up for that. How about you, Ed? What do you think are some of the next big problems in the user experience that emerging Web3 tech can be addressing that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, I think the first, I don't want to rehash everything that Atif said because he phrased it so well, right? But like just what we say is the experience of hopping into a Web3 game, especially for a non-crypto native, needs to be at worst the same thing that you experience on like an app store, right? Or Steam or the Epic Game Store. So the thirdweb team does a great job of helping cover a lot of those bases. The other piece is one that we've talked about a lot, and I think probably dear to you guys, is kind of this UA angle, right? Like we talk about that first iteration of Web3 games. Well, frankly, like they were mainly like kind of crypto savvy, crypto deep tech folks, right? And they were like, well, cool, I got a Discord set up and I got a couple thousand people in here. This really cool trailer. Like that's my marketing, right? And then the game launches and it's like a ghost town. It's like, well, what happened? That arguably makes or breaks the game as much as how fun the game is, right? Or like who's building the game. So we're starting to see some of these early display ad exchanges for Web3 games. I think you're starting to see stuff like traditional influencers and things like that. These are very Web2 AAA game type methodologies, but I think you got to start somewhere, right? And I think there's this holy grail, like at the end of the rainbow, where once we have hundreds of millions of users on chain, I think the future is non-custodial. So you actually have a passport that you can just bring, right? You have your non-custodial wallet you can bring to every game, has all your assets, all your tokens. Like that's the utopia. But until we get there, we kind of got to recreate a lot of these things that have made Web2 gaming successful, right? Like I worked at EA before this, and I worked on what's formerly known as FIFA, right? For some of that time. And I always tell people like FIFA or EAFC generates billions of dollars a year, but they also spend like 9 figures a year on UA, right? Because you still need to do that. So I think that that's the only other thing I'd add, which is like, how are you actually going to get these users in the top of the funnel? And, you know, maybe we move away from this Web3 focus into like, how do you actually bring normies into the fold? Otherwise, we won't be sitting here a year from now.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ed. I feel like that's the soapbox I've been on the most often with dev teams that I talked to recently is you can, in 2023, your business plan cannot be make a game for Web3 gamers. There's 10 of us. You have to build a great game and bring in mainstream players to it, whether you're using Web3 tech or not. So I do think you alluded to it, but some of these hybrid use case technologies, like we've mentioned and spoke with the team at Addressable, for example, they're using like on-chain data to do targeting through traditional like DSP and Twitter. So it's like combining like Web3 channels with Web3 targeting, or a company like Spindle that's trying to merge some of these problems of on-chain attribution with traditional attribution. So I think there's definitely like this kind of Web 2.5 ad tech ecosystem that's maturing a lot this year and going to be ripe for some of the user acquisition tactics for these games as they launch.
I'm going to hop in. I want to rip up the script and use you two to help settle a debate that Warren and I have about the Upptic go-to-market strategy. In the vein of UA, I have a thesis that we're not going to do mainstream UA until we get off using the browser as the main way to interface with these Web3 games. I'm curious if you guys think I'm an idiot for thinking that, or if you believe that that's correct, or at least maybe correct.
I'm the user acquisition guy for like 14 out of my 17 years of career. And so I agree with you. There are just issues with attribution on desktop and PC. We just know those. And I know that there's solutions out there that are fixing that. But I agree with you. And I think you're starting to see it, right? Like the more game developers you speak to in Web3, they're going for mobile first, right? Even when you look at some of the blockchains, they're talking about mobile first. Google's coming around. I think Apple will come around. So it's going to be.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think I'm a little bit less skeptical in the context of like, if you were to be able to use something like Steam or Epic, basically if you have it in a launcher, I think that there's something about just the interface of a browser, which it's really hard to do mainstream massive user acquisition for. And so that's, I guess, my thesis.
There's also, there's a distribution benefit, but there's also a trust benefit too. I mean, we've built a bad enough reputation for the Web3 gaming segment through bad actors over the last 2 years. And so I think anyone who is being asked to do a direct download of a Web3 game is at a massive disadvantage versus going through a trusted distribution platform. Last weekend, I was playing Gods and Chains through Epic, and it's like pretty seamless experience. And it's just nice to be able to boot up a trusted distribution platform and just launch a game directly from that, especially for a net new player. If you've never dabbled in a Web3 game, you've maybe only heard some scary stories because of what rises up in the media. I think, getting acceptance. You mentioned the evolving policies of Google. Atif is another great example of this. So for better or for worse, I do agree with Xander, your thesis that like the first breakthroughs are going to have to come through mainstream distribution platforms.
The main distribution platforms are something that a lot of Web3 companies have been sleeping on, but I think they'll get used to getting excited about working with them in the future. I know that's probably a controversial statement, but that's how I feel.
I mean, we're in the business of bringing games to massive global audiences, and you often need to go where the distribution is, unfortunately. And at least we see this real surgence of new distribution platforms, which, I mean, I think are coming. It's just, we'll see how long it takes. So Ed, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, I really, guys. And I think beyond the tech capabilities of attribution and stuff, which I think you guys are a little well-versed in that, it's more just, I would say these games on other platforms like console, PC, and even like mobile tend to be more complex and rich and more fun to play, right? And so if you're going to be applying a bunch of UA dollars to that, like you better hope that there is upside or there's ROI on the Twitch streams that you're sponsoring, right? Or the ad campaigns or the CPA campaigns. So I think those kind of coincide side by side with your argument there.
Towards the end of every episode, we like to look towards the future. And so I want to sort of just talk about, what do you guys see this looking like? I mean, we talked to Robbie Young last year. We had him on the podcast last year. And he said, in 5 years, every game is going to be an NFT. I think that's extreme. I don't think that's right. But I'm curious, what does the future of gaming look like, call it 2 to 5 years from now? And how integrated is Web3 technology into the games ecosystem at large?
I think that rather than saying everything will be an NFT or every game will be a blockchain game, I do think that at a bare minimum, the philosophies that Web3 gaming is introducing will be present in most games, right? And I think that largely depends on this next wave of these top, let's call them AAA, like high definition type Web3 games and how they do, right? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what gamers think about NFTs or blockchain or tokens, they're going to play what their friends play, right? The transition to battle passes and cosmetics and free to play, like people didn't love that either. But at a certain point, every game was like that and they started playing it, right? So if some of these games can find success, which I think we all believe that they can, again, I think publishers, the traditional Web2 publishers will tend to follow where the market's going, right? And if the players are voting and saying, hey, I want to own my items, I want yield on this, I want to be able to do certain things in the game, it may not make the most sense financially to provide these things, but you need to kind of capture and keep your clientele and your market share. So I do think these concepts like, hey, in the future, I could see there being kind of an open marketplace for all these types or certain types of in-game items. I think that can persist throughout, right? And I think this idea of like rewarding your user incentives and some of the really cool like UA or user identity things that we're talking about here, I think a lot of those things will persist at a bare minimum. And hopefully, we talked about like right now, this space is like, okay, great. There's some in-game items that might be NFTs, might be a token. I think we need to find success there. And then I think the sky's the limit on all these new kind of derivative or new genres that are going to pop up that Web3 and the tech will.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think very similarly to Ed, I think caveat there is like when mobile came out, everybody was like, console's going to go away. But actually what ended up happening is console companies had mobile strategies, right? And they still had a console strategy. And I think you'll start to see that when gamers start to take this seriously, game companies will have their console, you'll have a console strategy, a mobile strategy. It's called blockchain strategy instead of crypto or Web3. And I think that's what it'll become. There's just a different segment in the same industry. The key really is going to be how much does it actually grow the pie, right? Are we going to have a mobile moment where it doubles the pie of gaming? Or are we going to have just a nice little segment like a desktop? And I think that's the outstanding question. I'm hopeful that it ends up being very similar to mobile, but only time will tell as we start to see really great games come out to the market.
Yep, makes sense. Awesome. Well, this is really, really insightful. I really appreciate having you both on the podcast. Ed, if someone wants to get a hold of you or learn more about Ava Labs, how can they do that?
Yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, my handle is @EDC. DMs are open. If you want to follow all things going on Avalanche as it pertains to gaming, our handle is @GamingOnAbax. So all pretty easy. If you ever have any questions, want to learn more about what we're doing, just want to chat, happy to do so. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast as well. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. That's it. How about you?
My Twitter is just Atif Khan 31, ATIF KHAN 31. And then if you want to grab me over email, it's just atifatif@thirdweb.com. More than happy to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing. And also just love to meet new people in the gaming industry and just chat. So really appreciate you guys having me. I got to find a way to get above Andrew in that tally in the next few months. But appreciate you guys having me. It's always a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, excited to have you back. And yeah, we can start a competition to see who can do the most podcasts. Awesome. More anything before we sign off?
No, thanks so much, guys. This was great. I feel like I had a rudimentary knowledge of Appchains, and you guys really demystified a lot of stuff for me. I think I have a lot better practical use case understanding now for game developers. I'm sure our audience hopefully feels the same way. So thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Talk soon.